This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. At the moment of his death, it's likely that William McKinley assumed his name would live forever. As the 25th President of the United States, McKinley had helped steer his nation out of its worst economic slump prior to the Great Depression. He'd overseen a victorious war against a European power, shepherded through the annexation of Hawaii, the purchase of the Philippines, and supervised the creation of an American empire. At home too, he was popular, the first president to win consecutive second term in a quarter of a century. So, when he was gunned down by a terrorist in 1901, it must have seemed as if future generations would revere him alongside Abraham Lincoln. But of course, that's not what happened. Today, William McKinley is largely forgotten by the general public, known merely for being the guy whose death propelled VP Teddy Roosevelt to the White House, if he's remembered at all. So how did this happen? How did a man whose presidency seemed to usher in a new epoch slide so gently into oblivion? Today, Biographics is telling the story of William McKinley, the forgotten architect of the American century. Given how anonymous he is today, it's fitting that William McKinley's early life was so marvellously obscure. Born on January the 29th, 1843 in the small town of Niles, Ohio, young William grew up the seventh of 8 children, doing all the things that boys did for fun in the mid-19th century: swimming, hunting, and learning to ride a horse. His parents, too, were utterly ordinary. His mother a devout Christian, while his father ran a small foundry. It wasn't enough to make them rich, but it was enough to make them live without worry. Average as they were, though, there were 2 things that marked out the boys' parents as unusual. One was a ferocious belief in the value of education. Although they were happy in Niles, Mr. and Mrs. McKinley hated the idea of their kids growing up semi-educated ignoramuses. When William was just 10, they moved to the town of Poland just so that he could attend private school. But it was the second notable thing about his family that would have the biggest impact. Both Mum and Pop were ardent abolitionists. This was a time when many in the North campaigned against slavery's expansion, but stopped short of wanting to outlaw it in the South. The McKinleys, by contrast, drilled into their children that slavery was evil, that it was worth putting your life on the line to help eradicate it. And those beliefs would soon have a profound effect on young William's future. In 1860, a combination of illness and financial troubles forced 16-year-old McKinley to leave his college and return home, taking up work as a postal clerk to make ends meet. Barely had he settled into this role when news reached Ohio that a South Carolina militia had bombarded Fort Sumter, kickstarting the Civil War. Within weeks, McKinley had signed up, joining the Ohio 23rd Regiment, determined to do his duty, a duty that he'd carry out with jaw-dropping zeal. As a private, McKinley was almost suicidally brave, gaining a reputation for riding through dense cannon fire to deliver urgent messages. He served at Antietam, still regarded as the bloodiest single day in US history, where he charged through heavy enemy fire to deliver supplies to Union troops. It was antics like these that brought him to the attention of his commander, Rutherford B. Hayes. 20 years older than McKinley, Hayes regarded all his men as family, treating them with a respect that was legendary. But he seemed to have a special affection for the young man from Niles. After Antietam, he placed McKinley on his general staff. By the time the war was over, he seemed to consider the lad an honorary son. For his part, McKinley returned home with the rank of brevet major. For the rest of his life, those closest to him would refer to him affectionately as the Major. Yet while he might have returned to civilian life, McKinley wouldn't go back to his pre-war job. Back in Ohio, the young man opens a law practice in Canton, becoming locally successful. But the real change would come courtesy of his new mentor. In 1867, Rutherford Hayes came to McKinley and basically said, "Young man, I've decided to run for governor. Fancy doing my dirty work?" Stumping for Hayes that year was McKinley's first brush with politics, and evidently he liked what he saw. After Hayes won, the younger man threw himself into Republican politics. In 1869, he was elected prosecuting attorney of Stark County, and while that might seem like a minor post to start with, it really was just the start. Now he'd gotten a taste of it, McKinley wouldn't be content to just sit around with his thumb up his bottom in Stark County. Oh no. Instead, he was going to take that butt and that soiled thumb all the way to Since no one actually asked him, we can't say for certain, but it seems likely that McKinley would have regarded 1869 as the greatest year of his life. That's because 1869 wasn't just the year he moved into politics, but also the year he met Ida Saxton. Highly educated and extremely progressive on rights for women and African Americans, Ida was everything McKinley dreamed of in a partner. The pair met at a picnic that summer. By January 1871, they'd married. Just 11 months later, on Christmas Day, their daughter Catherine was born. Not long after, in 1873, their second daughter followed. But if 1869 was the highlight of McKinley's life, 1873 would represent the blackest depths. Just 4 months after being born, their youngest daughter died. Around the same time, Ida's mother passed away, and the combined tragedy seems to have broken her. For the rest of her life, Ida would be crippled with depression that only got worse when their daughter Catherine likewise died in 1875. Combined with a sudden onset of epilepsy, the mental breakdown helped turn her into an invalid, someone in need of long-term care. And care for her, William McKinley would. Throughout the rest of his story, even as his star rises, even as he becomes president, McKinley's number one concern will always be Ida. For some members of the public, this was scandalous. For others, admirable. But it's unlikely the future president gave a damn either way. For 4 short years, he and Ida enjoyed a perfect life. In return, he would now stand by her until the bitter end. Not that his extra duties as carer would get in the way of McKinley's rise. The same year his mentor, Rutherford Hayes, decided to run for the White House, McKinley ran for his own seat in Congress. So loyal was he to the older man, though, that he took time off from his own campaign to stump for him. Evidently, it didn't do any harm. That November, McKinley won a seat in the House of Representatives, a seat he would hold, bar a brief period following the 1882 election, for 14 years. In a whimsical little twist, McKinley celebrated his win by sticking a scarlet carnation in his lapel, a fashion choice that he kept up for the rest of his career. It would be thanks to this that Ohio adopted the carnation as its state flower in 1904. But while McKinley had deftly won his congressional run, the same couldn't be said for Hayes. The 1876 election was the tightest in history, with just a handful of contested electoral votes separating Hayes from his Democratic opponents. After a bitter political fight, the Democrats agreed to drop their claim to those all-important votes in return for President Hayes ending Reconstruction. For a supporter of African American rights, this was likely a nasty blow to McKinley. Not that he was brave enough to show it, though. Throughout his time in Washington, McKinley would remain on Hayes' good side, and in return, the president would help propel his career ever higher. By 1889, that included reaching the heights of chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, from where McKinley was able to pursue his pet project, tariffs. In this era, the Republican Party was broadly against free trade, preferring instead a form of protectionism to help boost American manufacturers. McKinley was all in on this, believing aggressive trade policies would help improve the lives of ordinary people. So much so that in 1890 he used his position to push through something known as the McKinley Tariff. Slapping import taxes on over 1,500 goods, McKinley confidently expected the act to raise prosperity for manufacturers, which it absolutely did. Unfortunately, it also sent consumer prices skyrocketing. The hike on goods was so eye-watering that it effectively dynamited the Congressional Republican Party. By the 1890 midterms, voters were so angry that the GOP lost 93 seats and control of the House. Among those swept out of office was William McKinley. Stung, hurt, McKinley slunk back to Ohio to run for governor. Although he won, it was hardly a resounding success. McKinley's margin of victory was barely a polling error. But politics is a winner-takes-all game, and whether voters were enthusiastic for him or not, McKinley was now the governor of the Buckeye State. It would be in this new role that he'd soon meet the man who'd make him president. So, we'll get back to today's video in just a minute, but first, here's a word from today's video sponsor, Squarespace. You know what's great about the summer? Bit of time off, time, to relax. But also, while you're relaxing, you're probably going to be daydreaming. Maybe that'll be about the next project you want to start. I just got back from vacation. Certainly the case for me. Fortunately, Squarespace gives you every possible tool you might want to fashion your next web project. Whether it's a small business, a sports blog, a creative portfolio, or just a page full of dank memes, it doesn't matter. If you can dream it, you can build it with Squarespace. Are you looking to get in and out quick without thinking too much about what your website should look like? Bam! Use one of their quick, beautiful templates to make a website that's fresh and for you. Or maybe you're more of a hands-on person. You like to have lots of opinions and ideas about what exactly your site should look like. Well, Squarespace gives you all the customization options you could ever want with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. Once you're done setting up your website, tinkering with the design if you're so inclined, or maybe just playing with the colors, there are so many extra features that Squarespace provides so your site can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 24/7 customer support, everything you want is in one place. So, start your new site by going to squarespace.com and you'll get a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/biographics and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. Mark Hanna occupies a strange, shifting place in McKinley's story. In the early 20th century, the wealthier Hyan was often cast in the role of puppet master, the guy who made McKinley president to push his own pet policies. Today, though, a more common view has it that McKinley used Hanna more than Hanna used him, leveraging his patron's wealth to pursue independent goals. Whatever the truth, there's no doubt their meeting while McKinley was governor set both men on the path back to Washington, but only after fate gave a little bit of a helping hand. In 1893, the same year that Rutherford Hayes went off to the great Ohio in the sky, Democrat Grover Cleveland began his second non-consecutive term in the White House. Unfortunately for his party, no sooner had he started than America was walloped by one of the worst depressions in history. The Panic of 1893 collapsed the economy. Unemployment jumped to 19%. Scores of banks and railroads failed. Savings were wiped out. Investors lost everything. Among those nearly destroyed was McKinley, who'd foolishly co-signed a $100,000 bank loan for a friend. When the friend went bust, McKinley was left on the hook for the money. Luckily, the uber-wealthy Mark Hanna stepped in to bail him out, and that left McKinley perfectly poised to reap the Depression's bitter rewards. With the economy in freefall, the electorate gave the Democrats a shellacking. The 1894 midterms remained the worst defeat of any party in an off-presidential election year. What the Republicans had suffered in 1890, the Democrats were now suffering 10 times over, and that meant 1896 was now looking like an assured GOP victory. All McKinley had to do was make sure that his name was on the ticket. By now, McKinley was a known quantity, having chaired the Republican National Convention and governed Ohio for years. But rather than take his chances, he was determined to make sure he was the delegate's only choice. Backed by Hanna's money and spin operation, McKinley ran perhaps the first recognizably modern nomination campaign in history, one marked by some interesting firsts. Perhaps the biggest was his decision to speak to 2 all-black audiences while campaigning, the first white candidate to ever do so. Yet, it would be in the presidential campaign itself that McKinley really redefined what American politics could be. Given the nomination that summer with Garrett Hobart as his VP pick, McKinley launched what was then the largest election campaign the nation had ever seen. Backed by a war chest of $4 million, the Republican Party flooded swing states with political leaflets, mailings, pins, badges, you name it, anything to keep their candidate's name in people's minds. McKinley himself, meanwhile, took the old-fashioned front porch campaign to a whole new level. In the months leading up to November, he invited a total of 750,000 people to hear him speak, and not just in any old order. Across 350 speeches, McKinley tailored his pitch to different groups. To the traditional Republican WASPs, but also to Jews, to Catholics, to black people, to emigres from Portugal, Bohemia, Germany, you name it. After decades in which the two parties had come to rely on their bases, McKinley was trying to build a big tent coalition, one that included as many traditional Democratic voters as possible. For their part, the Democrats put up the populist firebrand William Jennings Bryan. But while he had energy, Bryan was playing an old game, preaching to the choir, even as McKinley was luring them away to his exciting new chancel. That November, the results were unambiguous. McKinley beat Bryan by a margin of 600,000 in the popular vote and nearly 100 in the Electoral College. For those of us alive today, used to reading about Ronald Reagan's 1980 landslide or FDR crushing it in 1932, McKinley's victory might seem unspectacular, but make no mistake, in 1896 it was a political earthquake. For the first time since Ulysses S. Grant was re-elected a quarter century earlier, a candidate had won over 50% of the popular vote. The era of extremely narrow victories was over. McKinley had just won the most convincing mandate in a generation, and he would use that to completely upend politics. In one specific way, the election of William McKinley sparked the end of an era. Upon his inauguration, the 25th president became the 5th and last Civil War veteran to reach the highest office. Perhaps fittingly, his time in the White House would be dominated by conflict, but this time, the fighting would be taking place on American soil, but in the last remaining outposts of the Spanish Empire. Back in 1895, when McKinley was still just governor of Ohio, the people of Cuba had risen in revolt against Madrid, to which Madrid had responded by herding 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps, an insane overreaction that had done for Spain's reputation what the Newsnight interview did for Prince Andrews. By the time McKinley became commander-in-chief, the American public and press were demanding some form of intervention. At first, the new president kept things diplomatic. By gently applying pressure to Madrid, McKinley got the Spaniards to grudgingly release the camp prisoners and grant Cuba limited authority. This even led Washington sending the battleship Maine to Havana as a show of friendship. But then the 15th of February 1898 rolled around and everything went to hell. That day, a mysterious explosion destroyed the Maine in harbor, killing 226 crewmen. In the aftermath, a tsunami of anger washed over America. Before an investigation could be concluded, the press was whipping up fervor for war with Madrid. Not so long ago, historians believed that McKinley allowed this fervor to carry him along, dragging him into the war before he knew all of the facts, the Iraq War of the late 19th century. But newer scholarship disputes this version. In modern tellings, McKinley did all he humanly could to avoid war until it became necessary, desperately keeping diplomatic channels open until Spain angrily cut all contact. Whichever version is true, the outcome was absolutely the same. On the 23rd of April, Madrid declared war. 2 days later, Washington did the same, the first time America had declared war on a European power since 1812. Yet, while the War of 1812 would result in a messy draw, the Spanish-American War would have a much clearer outcome. By that, we mean the United States absolutely crushed Madrid. Within days, Spain's Pacific Fleet had been destroyed in the Philippines, not long after the Atlantic Fleet was sunk near Jamaica, and American troops were marching on Puerto Rico. Cuba itself, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt victoriously led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, with Santiago falling not long after. By the 12th of August, Spain had been defeated, and the war was over. A war in which McKinley had played a vital role, using newly installed telephones to talk to his generals in real time. Yet it wasn't the war itself that so shaped McKinley's presidency, but what came after. From the ashes of Spain's defeat, the 25th president helped build a true American empire. At the height of the fighting in July, McKinley had already signed an order officially annexing Hawaii. Now, with Madrid defeated, he oversaw a peace treaty that expanded Washington's holdings further still. Under the terms thrashed out, Puerto Rico and Guam became American possessions, and Cuba was nominally granted independence, but in reality was likewise drawn into Washington's orbit. But the biggest change was the purchase of the Philippines. For $20 million, Madrid signed over its Great Pacific Outpost. With that purchase, the US became a true colonial power. McKinley personally pushed hard for this, convincing the Senate to ratify the treaty with a 2/3 majority, convincing the House to appropriate millions for empire building. It was a hugely divisive decision, one which saw guys like Mark Twain eviscerate the president for wanting to emulate the corrupt empires of Europe. But Twain was in the minority. Enthusiastically backed by Teddy Roosevelt, McKinley embraced America's new role in the world, a role that would make it one of the world's great powers, a role that would also involve some very murky moral compromises. Just as it's hard to make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, so too is it hard to build an empire without breaking a whole lot of humans. In the case of the American Empire, most of that breaking came during the Philippine-American War. Having been freed from Spanish rule, a lot of Filipinos believed, not unreasonably, that their islands should belong to them. So when Uncle Sam instead rolled up and started draping everything in star-spangled banners, they tried their best to fight back. The result? McKinley sent in an American occupation force, one that met the rebels with brutal violence. By the time the war ended in 1902, it's estimated some 200,000 Filipinos had died. Many of the tactics that had so outraged Americans when used by Spain on Cuba were now turned on the Philippines with predictably awful results. Yet the Philippines wasn't McKinley's only post-war foreign adventure. In 1900, he committed troops without congressional approval to the Eight-Nation Alliance sent to put down China's Boxer Rebellion. It was a move that won the US a $25 million payout from China's post-invasion indemnity, while also confirming it as a nation newly willing to flex its muscle on the world stage. This is one of the reasons some call McKinley the architect of the American century, not just because he helped guide the country out of the 1890s depression and into prosperity, but because he set the blueprints for Washington's foreign interventionist policy. This was a policy that would echo through World War I. World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. Still, we don't want to paint his presidency as one entirely predicated on foreign policy. Even with the conflagration that was engulfing the Philippines, McKinley was likewise changing things back home. Perhaps his most notable achievement was to concentrate power back in the hands of the president. Following the Civil War, the US had gone through an era when real power seemed to lie with Congress. Now McKinley embarked on a great centralizing drive, making the White House once again the first among co-equal branches, paving the way for the extremely active presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson that would follow. Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, it's arguable that McKinley's most impactful domestic decision didn't involve, once again, raising tariffs or his laudable hiring of African Americans into diplomatic positions, but simply giving Roosevelt a job. Back in 1896, the younger man had campaigned heartily for McKinley, so much so that advisors wondered if the new president shouldn't reward him. Personally, McKinley didn't like the idea at all. He thought Roosevelt was too pugnacious, too unwilling to compromise. But he also recognized that Teddy had a sharp mind and was genuinely talented. So he decided to take a gamble on him, making him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That allowed Roosevelt to have a high-profile position to resign from when war broke out, allowed him to become a famous hero at the head of the Rough Riders, and return to Republican politics as one of the hottest properties. Yet this would still have been for naught, and McKinley not taken a second chance. On the 21st of November 1899, McKinley's original VP, Garrett Hobart, died in office. With no 25th Amendment, the position remained open until the 1900 Republican Convention, by which time Teddy was the favorite to join McKinley's ticket. Behind the scenes, though, McKinley's old patron, Mark Hanna, was unhappy. Like the president, he despised Teddy's macho style. In meetings, he impressed upon McKinley the need to find someone else. Anyone else. But McKinley knew talent when he saw it. Putting his personal feelings aside, he threw his weight behind the war hero for his VP pick. And with that one decision, the 25th president changed the course of American history. The 1900 election played out like a Disney live-action remake of 1896 that absolutely nobody needed to see. Once again, the Democrats put up William Jennings Bryan. Once again, McKinley trounced him, becoming the first president to be elected for a second consecutive term since Ulysses S. Grant. This time, however, the epilogue would be completely different. Recently, the administration had noticed McKinley receiving an alarming number of death threats. In this era, there was no dedicated Secret Service detail to provide security, just personal bodyguards who tried to urge the president to be more careful around the public. Unfortunately, this was also an era in which presidents were expected to be approachable, regularly seen chatting to citizens in the street. When McKinley's bodyguards asked him to be less conspicuous, he was basically like, absurd! What America would ever want to harm their president? To which the answer would soon turn out to be Leon Czolgosz. An unemployed Detroit mill worker with anarchist leanings, Czolgosz had gotten it into his head that McKinley was oppressing the working man and needed to be stopped. And since this was the great era of anarchist assassinations, Czolgosz didn't plan to stop McKinley via the ballot box. That September 1901, Czolgosz traveled to Buffalo, where McKinley was speaking at the Pan American Exposition. On September the 6th, the president stood outside the Temple of Music to shake hands with passers-by. Despite his bodyguards trying to get him to cut things short, McKinley insisted on continuing his greetings. At 16:07, the 25th president turned and held out his hand to the next man. Czolgosz took it, and with his free hand he fired 2 bullets into McKinley's stomach. The pandemonium that followed was bizarre in that, unlike JFK or Lincoln, McKinley remained conscious as it all unfolded. From his wounded position, he begged the angry crowd not to lynch Czolgosz, before turning to his private secretary, a guy called Cortelyou, saying, "My wife. Be careful, Cortelyou. How you tell her. Oh, be careful." In an odd way, it's touching to see how he remained so concerned about Ida to the very end. Not that everyone realized this was really the end. Rushed to hospital, McKinley was declared badly wounded, but likely to survive. Transferred to the nearby home of the exhibition's organizer, he began to recuperate. For several days, it looked like he'd pull through. And then the great horror of the pre-antibiotics world reared its head. Gangrene. The infection that took hold around the wound did what Czolgosz's bullets had failed to do. On the 14th of September 1901, William McKinley died in Buffalo, the third president to be assassinated. He was 58. The reaction to McKinley's death varied wildly by person. On vacation, Teddy Roosevelt found himself forced to hightail it to New York to take the oath of office. Mark Hanna, meanwhile, was seemingly more concerned about Roosevelt's election, snarling, "I told William McKinley it was a mistake to nominate this man in Philadelphia. I asked him if he realized what would happen if he should die. Now look, that damn cowboy is President of the United States." For his part, Leon Czolgosz never showed any remorse. He was executed on October the 29th of that year, his infamy assured. Mostly, though, the death of McKinley was marked by an outpouring of grief, one so vast it's comparable to the aftermath of JFK's assassination, one that made it seem like his name would live on forever. Instead, it was destined to slip into oblivion. Today, William McKinley sits alongside guys like William Taft and Calvin Coolidge in the special category of significant presidents most people have somehow forgotten about. Despite overseeing a successful war and dying tragically, there remain few monuments to him. Even Mount McKinley in Alaska was officially renamed Denali by the Obama administration in 2016, and so McKinley's great slide into anonymity continues. And in many ways, it's a pity. Although he wasn't perfect, McKinley oversaw a profound transformation in American history, a moment when the US went from being a regional power to a great power that was sitting atop a global empire. Without his lead, the expansionist presidency of Teddy Roosevelt would have been unthinkable. Take Teddy out of the equation, and you also have no presidents, Taft or Wilson, and suddenly American history starts to look really rather different. Yet McKinley was more than just a prelude to TDR. In his unshowy way, he changed what the presidency could be, changed what America was, how Americans thought about themselves and their place in the world. He may still be obscure today, but we are all still very much living in a future that McKinley helped create.